The epic history of Japan. Japan, the land of the rising sun. A place that feels like it exists in two worlds at once. One filled with neon-lit cities, bullet trains, and robotic precision, and another shaped by ancient temples, quiet forests, and traditions that seem untouched by time. Today, Japan stands as one of the most desired travel destinations on Earth, drawing millions of visitors each year who come to experience its beauty, its food, its history, and its remarkable innovation. But what most people don't realize is that Japan's openness to outsiders is actually a very recent development. For centuries, the country was closed off from the world, sealed behind a barrier of law and tradition, where foreign visitors were forbidden and Japanese citizens were not allowed to leave. That long era of isolation shaped everything: Japan's identity, its culture, and the powerful legacy we still see today. For more than 200 years, from the 17th century into the 19th, Japan lived under a policy known as sakoku, a period of isolation so intense that even the idea of leaving the islands could be punishable by death. Yet despite this closure, Japan wasn't stagnant. Japanese culture flourished, cities expanded, and society transformed. To understand how Japan went from isolation to becoming one of the most developed nations on the planet, we have to go back to the very beginning. The islands that form modern Japan have been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, with the earliest human settlers arriving from mainland Asia. They brought knowledge, agriculture, metalworking, and the kind of survival skills that allow small communities to turn into something more permanent. By the 3rd century AD, something remarkable had taken shape in the southern part of Japan, a growing centralized power based around the Yamato region, ruled by a monarch known as the Emperor. And from this point onward, Japan's story would be deeply influenced by ideas flowing in from the continent, especially from China and Korea. One of the most important influences came in the year 552, when Buddhism was introduced from Korea. This wasn't just a religious shift, it was cultural and political, reshaping values, art, architecture, and even governance. Then, in 645, Japan underwent what became known as the Taika reforms, a sweeping attempt to remodel the nation's political structure in the image of China's imperial system. That moment marked the beginning of the Heian period, a time that lasted nearly 400 years and became famous for culture, refinement, and artistic achievement. But as often happens with powerful institutions, the court slowly became obsessed with itself. Outside Kyoto, local noble elites began to take control of land that had once belonged to the emperor. A feudal system gradually emerged, and political power started to decentralize. Among the most powerful were the Taira and the Minamoto, clans backed by hardened samurai warriors, men trained not only to fight, but to live by a strict code of discipline and loyalty. The breaking point came in 1160 during the Meiji Rebellion, triggered by disputes over imperial succession. What started as political tension erupted into violence, and those tensions eventually exploded into full-scale war. The Genpei War, fought from 1180 to 1185. The Minamoto clan, led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, emerged victorious, defeating the Taira and establishing a new form of power. Instead of ruling from Kyoto alongside the emperor, Yoritomo created a separate military government based in Kamakura, far away from the imperial court. And in 1192 he secured the title of shogun, meaning great general, making him the true ruler of Japan in everything but name. That moment ushered in the era of the shogunate, a system of military rule that would dominate Japan for the next 700 years. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire, one of the largest empires in history, turned its attention toward Japan. In 1274, Mongol forces landed on the island of Kyushu, facing a determined Japanese defense that was badly outnumbered. A powerful typhoon swept through the region, obliterating the Mongol fleet. The Mongols tried again in 1281, launching a second invasion with even greater force. But once again, a massive typhoon destroyed their ships. The defense nearly bankrupted the shogunate's treasury, and many samurai were not properly rewarded for their service, planting seeds of resentment and instability. Over time, the relationship between the shogunate and the samurai clans weakened. Eventually, in 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo launched a coup, attempting to restore imperial power in Kyoto. Only 5 years later, in 1338, Go-Daigo was overthrown, and power returned to the shogunate under Ashikaga Takauji. The land was increasingly governed by powerful feudal lords called daimyo, men who held direct control over territories and commanded armies loyal to them alone. This violent and unstable era became known as the Sengoku period, or the Age of Warring States, a time when Japan was effectively torn apart from within. The Sengoku period was brutal, but it was also an era of innovation. Then, in 1543, something happened that would permanently alter the trajectory of Japanese history. A Portuguese trading ship was blown off course and landed on the island of Tanegashima, just south of Kyushu. The most valuable of these goods weren't spices or silk. They were weapons, European muskets. By 1556, more than 300,000 firearms were being used throughout the ongoing wars. They also introduced Christianity, and religion became tied to trade in powerful ways. Among the most important figures of this era was Oda Nobunaga, a powerful daimyo who embraced firearms and used them to change warfare itself. But in 1582, at the height of his rise, he was ambushed and killed. That man was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a figure whose life almost seemed impossible. He carried Nobunaga's mission forward and completed the unification of Japan. Before his death in 1598, Hideyoshi made his 5 most trusted subordinates pledge loyalty to his son until he was old enough to rule. The decisive showdown came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Tokugawa emerged victorious, and with that victory he created the Tokugawa shogunate, a new era that would last for 268 years. This period, known as the Edo period, would become one of the most defining eras in Japanese history. Peace descended over the land, something Japan hadn't truly experienced for centuries. But the Tokugawa shogunate understood something critical. Stability is fragile. And to prevent rebellion, they introduced strict controls. By 1638, Christianity was outlawed entirely. Then in 1639, the third Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, implemented the Sakoku policy. The only Europeans permitted were the Dutch, who were confined to a small artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki. Japan had effectively locked the door on the world. And yet, rather than collapsing, the country thrived. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, cracks began to show. At the same time, foreign ideas began to seep into Japan, quietly, subtly, through Dutch books imported via Dejima. In 1853, a fleet of American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay. The United States wanted Japan's ports opened for international trade, and Perry carried a message that was both an offer and a threat. Reluctantly, it agreed to open the country to American interests, later extending similar agreements to Britain, Russia, and other Western powers. Anger grew, especially in the southern provinces of Choshu and Satsuma. In 1868, they convinced the young Emperor Meiji to issue a decree calling for the end of Tokugawa rule. In 1869, the imperial court relocated from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, officially beginning the era known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji government chose modernization, fast, aggressive, and uncompromising. Railways were built, telegraph lines were installed, a universal education system was introduced. Japan built a modern standing army using Western tactics and equipment, replacing the samurai's traditional role as the country's warriors. In 1877, the government deployed its modern army to crush the Satsuma Rebellion, a revolt led by discontented samurai who felt their identity and purpose slipping away. Now armed with modern military power, Japan turned outward. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 shocked the world. In 1902, Japan signed an alliance with Britain to counter Russian influence in Asia. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 marked one of the most important turning points in modern history. At sea, the Battle of Tsushima ended in Japan annihilating Russia's fleet. Japan's status transformed overnight. By this time, Japan was no longer simply defending itself, it was becoming an empire. Like many nations after World War I, Japan experienced rising nationalism, fueled by economic pressures, military ambition, and the belief that expansion was the path to greatness. In 1937, Japan launched the Second Sino-Japanese War, escalating conflict on the Chinese mainland. As Japan expanded, the U.S. imposed harsh economic sanctions, attempting to cripple Japan's war effort. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States entered World War II and began a full-scale campaign against Japan. As casualties mounted, the United States realized a direct ground invasion of Japan would cause unimaginable losses. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing well over 100,000 people. Japan's surrender was conveyed to the Allies on August 14th and publicly announced by Emperor Hirohito the next day, speaking on national radio. Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, occupied Japan and began the reconstruction process. Japan's military was disarmed. The government was democratized. Under Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, Japan chose a different path: economic development instead of military aggression. By 1955, the Japanese economy surpassed its pre-war levels. By 1968, Japan became the world's second-largest capitalist economy. Over the following decades, Japan established itself as a global leader in automobile manufacturing and electronics, producing consumer goods that became symbols of quality, efficiency, and innovation. The economic boom transformed the country again, turning it into one of the world's most advanced societies, with high life expectancy, strong education, and technological leadership. And so Japan's journey, from ancient settlement to imperial courts, from samurai warlords to isolation, from forced opening to modernization, from empire to collapse, and finally to economic rebirth, is one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and reinvention. A story where tradition survived even as technology exploded. And above all, it is a reminder that history is not just made by conquest or wealth, but by the decisions people make when facing impossible circumstances. Japan endured, Japan changed, and Japan rose again.